Okay, so dear friends, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen who are watching us, today I'm really glad and honored actually to welcome you to today's webinar on understanding contemporary terrorist threats in Europe, hosted by the MENA Research Center. And my name is Kolesnyk, and since last April, I'm president of this center, and it is my honor to open this discussion. In an era marked by evolving security challenges, understanding the landscape of terrorist threats facing Europe is more important than ever. Today, we will delve into the complexities of these threats, which include domestic extremism, state-sponsored operations, and Islamist terrorism. It is important to note, however, that while the term Islamist terrorism is commonly used in Europe to describe acts of violence perpetrated by the groups that claim to act in the name of Islam. But many in the Muslim world actually prefer the term religious terrorism. And this distinction actually helps us to avoid conflicting the actions of extremist groups with the broader Muslim community, thereby preventing the stigmatization of an entire religion based on the actions of certain individuals. So during our webinar, our goal is to shed light on the drivers, methods, and impacts of these threats on European societies and institutions, as well as the challenges they pose to internal stability and security cooperation across the continent. Just recently, at the beginning of June, our Ministry of Interior, and when I say our Ministry of Interior, I mean the French Ministry of Interior, has published a comprehensive report on the activities and influence of the Muslim Brotherhood in France. This report highlights several crucial points that are relevant to our discussion today, underscoring the adaptability and resilience of this organization, which has managed to establish a significant network and influence despite facing considerable scrutiny and regulatory challenges. And I guess our distinguished guests from the first panel will also talk about it. The report I'd like to mention is actually the report on the Russian state terrorism and state sponsorship of terrorism that was published in September 2024 by the International Center for Counterterrorism based in the Netherlands. And Professor Machnikowski will definitely mention this report. There are also a few reports published recently by the Expo Foundation in Sweden, and it will be to Mr. Finnsiö to mention those reports at his panel. We have assembled a distinguished panel of experts, as you can see, and who will provide insights into various facets of contemporary terrorism. Our first session will focus on Islamist terrorism and political Islamism, exploring its ideological roots and the influence of non-violent but impactful groups. And this session will be led by Dr. Youssef Chiheb, Researcher Director at the French Center for Intelligence Research, CFDR, and Ahmed Al-Rumoh, a political Islam researcher from Syria. The second panel will be run by Mr. Morgan Finnsiö, a far-right extremism researcher from the Expo Foundation in Sweden, and who will analyze the rise of far-right homegrown extremism in the West and the implications for counterterrorism policy. And this session will provide a deeper understanding of the US terrorist designation of the Nordic resistance movement and its broader significance. Our third panel will be led by Professor Ryszard Machnikowski, Dean of the International Political Studies Faculty at the University of Łódź in Poland. And he will discuss Russian state terrorism, the use of hybrid tactics to destabilize Europe, including support for extremist groups, offering a comprehensive view of state-sponsored terrorism. Finally, we will conclude our meeting today with the Q&A session moderated by Harold Hyman, who is a Franco-American journalist and the associate expert at the MENA Research Center, where you will have the opportunity to engage into discussion and delve a bit deeper into the topics discussed. And on the final note, but the most important note, I believe, is that I would like actually to extend my gratitude to our speakers for sharing their expertise, to Mohammed Kudmani, who is our managing director and who, to be honest, puts significant efforts into this webinar, as well as all our team for all support, especially the tech guy. You're amazing. And I'd like to thank you all for also joining us today. Your participation is vital in fostering deeper understanding of these crucial issues. Thank you, and let us embark on this insightful and I hope interesting conversation together. Youssef, C'est à toi. On ne t'entend pas par contre, il faut que tu... voilà, exactement. So
Bonjour.
Mr. Youssef Chiheb, he will speak in French, but the translation will be carried out by Mr. Harold Hyman.
Yes. Alternatively, I don't work at the UN, so 3 sentences, stop. Please, thank you.
Bonjour à tous.
Bonjour.
Bonjour mes chers collègues. Je remercie Harold qui va avoir la gentillesse et l'élégance de traduire ce que je vais dire en français parce que là, je ne suis pas anglophone. Pour parler de ce problème qui est un problème à la fois sécuritaire, géopolitique et idéologique, il faut essayer de le lire non seulement par le prisme de la recherche universitaire, mais également par le prisme du renseignement. J'ai eu la chance, dans ma carrière d'universitaire à la Sorbonne, d'avoir été détaché pendant 4 ans au service central du renseignement territorial français, où on a travaillé sur la notion de la menace endogène, la menace en France, et non pas le terrorisme au Moyen-Orient ou en Afrique du Nord. Et donc, ma participation sera axée sur la menace intérieure endogène concernant le terrorisme. À vous, Harold.
Merci. All right. So, to speak of this security problem in geopolitical and ideological terms, Youssef has gone beyond just university research, that prism, but has also gone into the intel prism. And during his career at the Sorbonne, he was detached for 5 years at the territorial services of the French police, where he covered the internal threat, and as distinguished from the external terrorist threat.
Merci, merci Harold. Alors, tout d'abord, l'islam en tant que tel, c'est pour simplifier, pour en faire vite, c'est comme de la pâte à modeler. On peut en faire une religion, on peut en faire une théologie, on peut en faire une idéologie, on peut en faire du terrorisme ou du djihadisme, selon le contexte, selon la concentration démographique des communautés musulmanes dispersées en Europe et notamment en France. Tout d'abord, il y a l'islam théologique qui s'est infiltré en France par la mouvance wahhabite de l'Arabie saoudite, de par son rôle historique et géopolitique en tant que gardien des 2 lieux saints de l'islam pour préserver un islam rigoriste, fondamentaliste, basé essentiellement sur la charia. Ensuite, il y a l'islam idéologique.
Chef,
oui.
Je te prie de me pardonner, on va laisser Harold traduire.
Pardon.
Islam as such, to put it simply, is like putty. You have the religious, the theological, the ideological, and the terrorism and the jihad aspects. And each aspect depends on the density of the diaspora in a given area. And the first type that Youssef is considering is a theological type. And it derives from the Wahhabi influence, the Wahhabis being the guardians of the holy sites, and they are fundamentalists and rigorists, as we say in French, and their goal is Sharia.
Cet islam wahhabite a 2 fonctions essentielles. La première, comme je l'ai rappelé, c'est garder les lieux saints de l'islam comme l'épicentre du monde musulman, mais surtout aussi la garde rapprochée de la monarchie ou des monarchies du Golfe. Donc cet islam ne concerne pas la France, en tout cas, il n'a pas de ramification avec le terrorisme au sens étymologique du terme. Harold.
Right. This Wahhabism, this Wahhabi Islam has two aspects. So it's guarding the holy sites as being central to Islam, and also being the bodyguards of the Gulf monarchies, and therefore has no, I would say, a logical ramification with terrorism in France.
Ensuite vient en deuxième position l'islam idéologique. L'islam idéologique, c'est-à-dire qui part de la substance religieuse pour en faire une idéologie politique. En l'espèce, les frères musulmans qui ont émergé dans les années 20 en Égypte avec Hassan al-Banna pour construire un islam nationaliste, pan-arabique, pana-islamique pour contrer la colonisation et pour restituer cette Oumma musulmane décadente depuis la chute de l'Empire ottoman. Harold.
Against decadence. Right. So then there's the ideological variety of Islam, and it goes from religion to political ideology. And it is fueled by the Muslim Brothers, Ikhwan, okay, who were formed in the 1920s in Egypt by Al-Banna. And they have injected pan-Islamism and pan-Arabism together, and they aimed it against the colonizer in order to bring about the Ummah, which would then get rid of the decadence of the Western lifestyle.
Merci. Enfin, il y a l'islam djihadiste et terroriste. C'est l'islam qui est apolitique et qui est aterritorial, c'est-à-dire qu'il ne revendique pas un territoire, qu'il ne revendique pas une ligne politique, mais qui s'inscrit dans la lignée de Ibn Taymiyyah, le fondateur de djihad, contre, dans un premier temps, les mécréants pendant la croisade, et ensuite contre la colonisation, et tout acte de djihad est une rétribution auprès de Allah. Et la révolution dite arabe ou le printemps arabe a fait sortir cette déferlante de l'islam djihadiste, terroriste, notamment dans la zone irako-syrienne où le fantasme d'un État musulman était posé sur la table en l'espèce Daesh. Et donc, le concept djihadiste repose sur la reconstitution du puzzle géopolitique après le déclin et la nakba du monde arabo-musulman. Harold.
Just one point, you said Ibn Taymiyyah, la personne qui a fondé
Ibn Taymiyyah. Ibn Taymiyyah.
Ibn Taymiyyah. Okay.
Taymiyyah.
Okay. So then there is the jihad and terrorist variety, which is non-political and non-territorial, which means it does not claim any political line nor any territory. And it was founded by Ibn Taymiyyah. Now, if I'm not mistaken, you spoke of the Crusades. It's I suppose, supposed to counter the Crusaders, but I guess Ibn Taymiyyah is a modern person. And also, it's aimed against the colonizers. And the Arab Springs let open this tendency. And this tendency tried to establish itself in Iraq and Syria and create an Islamic state through Daesh. And the concept is to reconstitute an Islamic zone since Nakba.
And if I may, just to, je vais le dire en français, nous avons à peu près encore 7-8 minutes au max pour votre intervention.
D'accord. Alors, mais dans tout cette compartimentalisation, cette typologie des islams, l'islam politique est vraisemblablement le plus dangereux en Europe et en France pour les raisons suivantes. C'est que d'abord, il se distingue du salafisme qui est constitué sur des pratiques sociétales, communautaristes, enfermées sur elles-mêmes. L'islam politique est en train de gagner du terrain au niveau des territoires européens par le principe de l'entrisme dans les entreprises, dans les universités, dans les lycées sous contrat, dans les corps intermédiaires. Sa cible, ce sont des étudiants bac+5 en master ou en doctorat pour constituer une élite politique de nature à constituer un parti à terme politique qui rentre dans le jeu démocratique en Europe pour des raisons très simples. C'est le déclin démographique en Europe, c'est la forte natalité musulmane en Europe, c'est la déchristianisation européenne et c'est le problème qui se pose autour du concept de la laïcité. Autant d'éléments qui contribuent à son expansion loin des radars du renseignement, puisque l'islam politique ne se pratique pas dans les mosquées, ni dans les salles de prière, mais dans des universités, dans des séminaires, dans des webinaires comme ce que nous sommes aujourd'hui. Donc, les services de renseignement sont encore en retard par rapport à cette menace. Ils ont certes contenu la menace terroriste, djihadiste, violente, mais l'islam politique est en pleine expansion. Harold, merci.
So, in all these compartmentalizations, these typologies, it is political Islam, which is the most dangerous. Why? Because it is different from Salafi Islam, which Salafi Islam tries to introduce precepts of lifestyle. That's its main focus. Whereas the political Islam enters civil society, it enters companies, workplaces, universities, schools, and it aims at educated people, educated young people. And it takes advantage of the demographic decline that surrounds it. And it attacks also secularism, laïcité in French. And this Islam in universities, in seminars, in Zoom meetings like this one, has largely escaped the remit of the intelligence agencies, who have a lot of trouble tracking it after they have succeeded in containing the jihad type of terrorism.
Et pour terminer, l'islam politique a déjà réalisé une expérience politique. Je rappelle que l'islam politique a gouverné pendant 2 législatures, 10 ans au Maroc, le PJD, le Parti de justice et du droit, le Front islamique du salut en Algérie, le Parti Ennahda en Tunisie, Al-Jama'a al-Islamiyya en Égypte, les frères musulmans en Jordanie, les frères musulmans en Turquie. Tous ces pays ont l'islam politique est arrivé au pouvoir. Et il est arrivé au pouvoir par les urnes et non pas par la violence. Et c'est tout le danger de cette idéologie auquel les services de renseignement européens doivent être vigilants parce que l'islam politique est un corps invertébré, soluble dans tous les corpus démocratiques et régimes politiques. Donc, tous les pays qui ont été traversés politiquement par les frères musulmans, nous n'oublions pas la dimension financière. Le Qatar est le principal sponsor des frérismes, des Ikhwan, puisque selon les dernières statistiques, il a injecté 17 milliards de dollars pour le financement de l'ensemble des activités intellectuelles et de cooptage des élites et des minorités agissantes en se joignant ici ou là, pour le cas de la France, avec des mouvances d'extrême gauche, comme le cas de la France insoumise. Harold, merci beaucoup.
Right. So political Islam has already succeeded at various political experiments. This political Islam has governed Morocco for 10 years with the Democratic Development and Justice Party in Morocco, the Islamic Salvation Front in Algeria has also exercised power, and Nada in Tunisia, the Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan and Turkey have gained power through the ballots and not through violence. And that is the threat. And intelligence agencies must be vigilant because that danger is very difficult to pinpoint. And it has a financial aspect. Qatar, according to official statistics, has contributed $17 billion in financing of co-optation of minorities, and have also joined this, the finance has helped the political Islam to join forces with far left parties such as La France Insoumise here in France.
Est-ce que j'ai encore le temps, juste pour conclure?
Si vous voulez, vous pouvez avoir vraiment une brève dernière intervention et après on est obligé d'écouter notre autre collègue.
Alors, la seule exception où l'islam politique est violent et verse dans le terrorisme, c'est le mouvement Hamas. Le mouvement Hamas est la seule traduction sur le terrain de l'expression armée, violente, contre l'existence de l'État d'Israël. Merci beaucoup.
And there is one exception to the portrait that we just exposed of political Islam coming to power through democratic means. It is Hamas, because it is violent and terrorist, and its only goal is to conduct armed conflict with the state of Israel.
Thank you very much. And right now, we move forward on our agenda, and we have Mr. Ahmed Al-Rumoh, who will talk about the political Islam, and he will expose his knowledge and vision on this matter. And he will speak in Arabic, so our managing director, Mohammed Kudmani, will translate it into English. The floor is yours.
أستاذ أحمد
معكم أنا.
تفضل الكلمة لك.
نعم. حول تحياتي للجميع، السلام عليكم. حول مفهوم الجذور الإيديولوجية للتطرف الإسلامي، وأنا أحب أن أقول الإسلاموي، حتى نفهم كيف وصل التطرف الديني إسلاميا إلى ما وصل إليه اليوم، يجب أن نعرف تاريخية نشوئه وأسبابها. فقد ساهمت في نشوء التطرف والعنف الإسلامي مرحلتان، الأولى تاريخية والثانية معاصرة. التاريخية قامت بالتأسيس، فقد ولدت مع الخلاف السياسي بين علي بن أبي طالب ومعاوية حول السلطة بالقرن الأول، ونتج عن هذا الصراع السياسي فرقتين ما تزال مختلفتين إلى اليوم، هما السنة والشيعة. هذا الخلاف السياسي حتى يكون له حاضن اجتماعي بدأت عملية أدلجته نصوصيا، إما بتأويل النصوص فكل طرف أول النص القرآني لصالحه، أو من خلال السنة النبوية، حيث
Mr. Rumoh, just a second for Mohammed to translate.
No, we will take them like 3 parts, Denise. It's fine.
Okay.
We're gonna finish like, yeah.
Okay.
It's
So
gonna be
go ahead.
faster. It's gonna be
Okay.
faster because we have it written.
Okay. Go ahead.
تابع؟
تفضل.
أو من خلال السنة النبوية حيث تم وضع أي اختلاق نصوص تمت نسبتها للنبي تدعم الموقف السياسي لهذا الطرف أو لذاك. ولا ننسى أن الخلافات داخل هاتين الفرقتين بدأت تتشظى، ومن كل فرقة ظهرت فرق متطرفة، مثلا ظهرت فرقة الخوارج والحشاشون إلى آخر تلك الفرق ذات السلوك العنفي مع الآخر. وكان التأويل السياسي للنص القرآني والأحاديث الموضوعة على لسان النبي ليست إلا محاولات لتبرير العنف وإلغاء الآخر وإثبات أحقية هذا الطرف أو ذاك بقيادة الإسلام والسلطة. هذه الفقرة كمل أبو يوسف ترجمتها حتى أتابع بالأسباب المعاصرة.
Okay. شكرا أستاذ أحمد. Hello everyone. To understand how Islamic religious extremism has evolved to its current states, it's essential to examine the historical context of its emergence and the driving factors behind it. This rise of Islamic extremism and violence can be attributed to 2 primary phases, one historical and the other is contemporary. The historical phase, the phase originated from the political conflict between Ali bin Abi Talib and Muawiyah over the leadership during the 1st century of Islam. This political struggle gave rise to 2 major sects, Sunni and Shia, whose doctrinal and political differences persist to this day. In order to secure a socio-political base, these sectarian differences underwent a process of ideological codification through religious texts. Each faction interpreted the Quranic verses and the prophetic tradition, which is hadith. To legitimize its political position, in many instances, fabricated hadith were attributed to the Prophet Muhammad in support of one side over the other side. Furthermore, internal divisions within both Sunni and Shia sects led to the emergence of splinter groups such as Kharijites and Assassins, among others, many of whom adopted violent and explosionary practices towards dissenters. The political interpretation of the Quran and the use of apocryphal hadith served as a means to justify violence, legitimize opposing views, and assert the rightful leadership of one group over the other within Islam. Ustaz Ahmed.
نعم. الآن ننتقل إلى الأسباب المعاصرة. الأسباب المعاصرة ونشوءها اعتمدت أولا على التأويلات القرآنية السياسية وما سمي بالحديث المنسوب للنبي لتكون مرتكزا ومرجعا للجماعات المتطرفة المعاصرة. من الخطأ العلمي أن ننسب التطرف للفكر السلفي التاريخي. فالفكر السلفي التاريخي منذ ابن حنبل حتى المعاصرين من السلفية العلمية لم يكن عنيفا ولا متطرفا، إنما كان يكتفي بتقديم أدلته النصوصية القرآنية والنبوية والتراثية لمخالفيهم، لكنه لم يستخدم العنف تاريخيا. لكن فيما بعد ولدت حركات متطرفة استخدمت العنف والإرهاب ضد مخالفيها، اعتمدت تلك النصوص التراثية التاريخية لإثبات مشروعيتها، فكانت الذريعة فيما بعد للسلفية الجهادية التي تولدت منها داعش وجبهة النصرة وغيرها. هذه أيضا المرحلة المعاصرة مرت ب3 مراحل، هي أتابع أستاذ محمد.
Okay, the contemporary phase, modern extremism drew up these historical, political, theological interpretations as foundational references. Contemporary extremism groups rely heavily on these pre-modern texts to legitimize their ideologies and actions. It's mistake, however, to attribute modern extremism solely to the traditional Salafi thoughts. Historical Salafism, from the era of Ahmed ibn Hanbal to the modern proponents of scientific Salafism, was neither violent or extremism. These scholars typically engaged their intellectual opponents through Quranic and classic textual evidences without resorting to violence. However, extremism movements eventually emerged that did embrace violence and terrorism against their adversaries, exploiting historical text to construct a framework of legitimacy. These movements laid the ideological groundwork for jihadi Salafism, from which groups like ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra and other groups. تفضل أستاذ.
نعم. إذن المرحلة المعاصرة مرت بثلاث مراحل أيضا. المرحلة الأولى هي المرحلة القطبية، وكل من جاء بعدها يعتمد التأصيلات الإيديولوجية للمرحلة القطبية. المرحلة القطبية هي نسبة لسيد قطب. بهذه المرحلة بدأت بنهاية الخمسينات أثناء الصراع بين جمال عبد الناصر والإخوان المسلمين بمصر، بعد أن فشل الاتفاق بين الطرفين وتفرد عبد الناصر بالسلطة. هذا التفرد جعل بعد الخلاف، وهناك خلاف حتى شخصي، يعني أنا درست الأمر تماما بالموضوع ما بين سيد قطب وعبد الناصر. بدأ سيد قطب يؤدلج الصراع ضد عبد الناصر على أنه صراع بين الإيمان والكفر، وأن المجتمع الذي يقف في صف عبد الناصر ضد تطبيق الشريعة وحكم الإخوان فهو مجتمع جاهلي مستعيرا أفكار أبي الأعلى المودودي بالهند، ونجح بشكل كبير في تعريب أفكار المودودي لخدمة التطرف الإخواني. ومن هنا أعيد إحياء الإيديولوجيات المتطرفة والإلغامية وأعيد ولادتها الحاكمية، جاهلية المجتمع، الولاء والبراء إلى آخره. واستعر الخلاف بين الطرفين الذي قمعه عبد الناصر وانتصر فيه، مما أسس مظلومية داخل مدرسة الإسلام السياسي، هي مظلومية الإخوان المسلمين. وبدأ الإخوان الذين خرجوا مهزومين من المعركة بدأوا بترتيب أفكارهم بهدوء بعد هزيمتهم أمام عبد الناصر، فجاءت جماعة التكفير والهجرة مؤسسها شكري مصطفى نهاية الستينات، والجماعة الإسلامية التي أسسها ناجح إبراهيم مطلع السبعينات، وما فعلته بمصر معروف، ولكن هؤلاء أبناء المدرسة القطبية. أستاذ محمد.
The contemporary phase can be further divided into three subphases. The Qutbist phase, indicated to Sayyid Qutb. This phase began in the late of 1950s during the conflict between Egyptian President Jamal Abdel Nasser and the Muslim Brotherhood, after the collapse of a potential alliance and Nasser's consolidation of power. Sayyid Qutb began to frame the conflict as one between belief and unbelief. He branded society that supports Nasser and opposed the application of Sharia law allowed by the Brotherhood as being in a state of jahiliyyah. Jahiliyyah means pre-Islamic ignorance. Drawing one of the ideas of Abu al-Ala al-Mawdudi from the Indian subcontinent, Qutb successfully adapted these notions to serve the ideological framework of Brotherhood-linked extremism. The period witnessed the revival of radical ideological concepts such as al-Hakimiyya, divine sovereignty, al-Jahiliyyah, ignorant society, and al-Wala and al-Bara, which means loyalty and disavowal. Nasser's suppression of the Brotherhoods intensified the ideological divide that cultivated a sense of victimhood within the Islamic political movement. This sense of greediness led to the groundwork of the emergence of more radical groups. By the 1960s, movements such as Takfir al-Hijra founded by Shukri Mustafa, and Al-Jama'ah al-Islamiyya established by Najih Ibrahim in the early 1970s in Egypt began to surface, each further radicalizing the ideological and operational framework of Islamic extremism. أستاذ أحمد.
نعم، المرحلة الثانية مرحلة الطليعة المقاتلة في سوريا. هذه المرحلة نشأت بسوريا أثناء الخلاف بين حافظ الأسد والإخوان المسلمين، ونتيجة بطش حافظ الأسد بقواعد الإخوان اتخذ مروان حديد وعدنان عقلة القرار بأن العنف والإرهاب هما السبيل الوحيد لمقارعة الأسد، فتأسس تنظيم الطليعة المقاتلة كحالة تمرد على تنظيم الإخوان المسلمين بسوريا، وأبرز ما قام به من إرهاب وعنف إضافة للاغتيالات الفردية لعناصر من الأمن السوري والمتعاونين مع الأمن والنظام تمثل بعمليتين خطيرتين يذكرها المجتمع السوري تماما. العملية الأولى عملية مجزرة المدفعية في حلب يونيو 1979 قام بها إبراهيم اليوسف، والعملية الثانية تفجير مقر المخابرات السورية في حي الأزبكية بدمشق ب 13 نوفمبر 1981، وراح ضحية هاتين العمليتين العشرات من الطائفة العلوية، مما أعطى المبرر لحافظ الأسد للبطش بهم وإرهاب المجتمع السوري والتفرد بالسلطة، وانتهت المواجهة بين الأسد والإخوان بانتصار حافظ الأسد. أبو يوسف. ما في صوت أبو يوسف.
Yeah, sorry, thank you. The second phase, the militia vanguard phase, which is known in Syria as Taliya al-Muqatala. The phase emerged in Syria during the conflict between Hafiz al-Assad and the Muslim Brotherhood in response to the brutal crackdown on Brotherhood members by Assad's regime. Figures like Marwan Hadid and Adnan Al-Oqla concluded that violence and terrorism were the only viable means of confronting the regime. As a result, the Fighting Vanguard organization was established as a rebellious offshoot of the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood. This group carried out numerous acts of terrorism and violence, including targeted assassinations of Syrian security personnel and their collaborators. Among their most notable operations were the Artillery School Massacre in Aleppo, June 1979, and the Azbakiya bombing in Damascus, November 13, 1981, which targeted an intelligence facility. These attacks resulted in the death of dozens, primarily from the Alawite sect, providing Hafiz al-Assad with the pretext to intensify his repression, terrorize Syrian society, and consolidate authoritarian rule. The confrontation ultimately ended with Assad's victory and the suppressions of the Muslim Brotherhood. أستاذ أحمد.
نعم، الآن نأتي إلى المرحلة الثالثة من المرحلة المعاصرة للتطرف الإسلامي، هي مرحلة السلفية الجهادية التي اعتمدت على المراحل والعوامل والنقاط التي ذكرناها آنفا. السلفية الجهادية بدأت بعد الصحوة الإسلامية. الصحوة الإسلامية كانت من ضمن أدوات الحرب الباردة. أدار لعبة الصحوة الإسلامية من الخلف الإدارة الأمريكية، وكانت أدوات تنفيذها في الشرق ضياء الحق بالباكستان، أنور السادات بمصر، الملك فيصل بالسعودية، لتقويض ووقف التمدد الشيوعي بالشرق الأوسط. كما استخدم الأمريكان المجاهدين العرب والأفغان لطرد النفوذ السوفيتي من أفغانستان وإسقاط نظام نجيب الله الحليف له. لكن بعد تفكك الاتحاد السوفيتي وانتصار الحلف الأمريكي، تنكر الأمريكان للمجاهدين العرب والأفغان بعد أن كانوا يستقبلونهم بالبيت الأبيض. هذا شكل ردة فعل عنيفة ضد الأمريكان، فتشكلت السلفية الجهادية المعاصرة بقيادة عبد الله عزام وابن لادن، وكانت من نتائجها هجمات أيلول سبتمبر بأمريكا 2011 حتى ودخلت في صراع عالمي حتى تم القضاء على التنظيم أمريكيا بقتل ابن لادن ثم الظواهري في الحملة الأمريكية الشهيرة بأفغانستان. لكن الغزو الأمريكي للعراق ساهم بإعادة إحياء الفكر السلفي الجهادي من خلال أبو مصعب الزرقاوي وتنظيم القاعدة في العراق والشام. أستاذ محمد.
The third phase, the Jihadi Salafist phase. This phase followed the so-called Islamic awakening, which has emerged as a part of the broader geopolitical dynamics of the Cold War. The Islamic revival was, to a large extent, orchestrated from behind the scenes by the United States, with key figures including Ziya al-Haq in Pakistan, Anwar Sadat in Egypt, and King Faisal in Saudi Arabia as tools to counter Soviet influence in the Middle East. Arab and Afghan mujahideen were mobilized to expel Soviet forces and dismantle the pro-Soviet regime of Najibullah in Afghanistan. However, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the American victory in the Cold War, the US dissolved the very fighters it had once supported, many of whom had even been welcomed into the White House. The betrayal sparked a backlash against the United States and catalyzed the formation of modern jihadi Salafist movement led by figures such as Abdullah Azzam and Osama bin Laden. The most dramatic expression of this movement was the September 11 attacks on the USA, which eventually led to bin Laden's death during the American campaign in Afghanistan. Nonetheless, the US invasion of Iraq revived jihadi Salafist ideology primarily through Abu Musab al-Zarqawi and the emergence of Al-Qaeda in Iraq and Levant. حجيد عند ISIS وأخواتها.
IS وأخواتها, yeah.
ISIS and its offshoots, the Arab Spring, so popular uprising met with violent repression by authoritarian.
خلينا أطرحها أبو يوسف معك.
أوكي تفضل.
نعم.
ما عاد
نأتي إلى IS وبريطانيا.
حجي ما عاد عندنا كثير وقت لهم.
أوكي خلصت أنا دقيقتين فقط. لما جاء الربيع العربي بطشت الأنظمة المستبدة بالجماهير اللي خرجت تعبر عن رأيها وتريد التغيير السياسي دون أن يحرك المجتمع الدولي ومنظمات حقوق الإنسان ساكنا، مما جعل الذهاب باتجاه التطرف والعنف الذريعة والسبيل لوقف وحشية الأنظمة ضد المتظاهرين. كانت البيئة شبه جاهزة نتيجة المظلومية العامة للشعوب العربية والخذلان الأمريكي، فتشكلت داعش التي هي بشكل أو آخر إحياء للسلفية الجهادية من خلال إدارة التوحش، وجعلها سلوكا التوحش عاما لها ضد خصومها وحتى من يقف ضد من يقف على الحياد في معركتها ضد الأنظمة الدكتاتورية. كل هذه الأطراف الإرهابية استخدمت المظلومية الفلسطينية، تسليم العراق لإيران، وقوف الغرب مع الأنظمة المستبدة، إضافة لاعتمادها على النصوص المؤسسة للتطرف والعنف الإسلامي التي ذكرناها في البداية. فكانت مرحلة التوحش الجديدة من التطرف الديني. ويبدو أن الغرب لم يتعلم من الدرس، وستبقى دائرة العنف دائرة عندما دعم جبهة النصرة في وقت وقام بتمكينها بالوصول للسلطة إلى سوريا. وما تزال طبعا ثقافة الإنسانية في التربية والتعليم غائبة، وثقافة النقد والحوار وقبول الرأي الآخر، إضافة إلى ما يحدث بغزة في فلسطين ودعم الغرب لتنظيمات أحيانا متطرفة. وأيضا لا ننسى فتح مواقع التواصل يستطيع من خلالها المتطرفين والإرهابيين أن يقولوا ما يريدون. تفضل أبو يوسف.
And just before you translate, Mohammed, I have to remind that we are all our guests have other as well commitments, and we already 5 minutes past this panel, so I'm asking you to please speed up this so that we can.
If you want, go ahead, Dennis, to the next. To get to the next.
Yes,
then
exactly.
If we have some more time, I can translate the last part.
And how much time do you have, more or less? Because if you have 2-3 minutes, we can do this. But if it's 10 minutes more, so
it's 2-3 minutes, the same
3
time.
minutes. Okay. Is it okay for you, Morgan? Okay, so we do this and then we go to the next.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm gonna do it so fast. ISIS and its offshoots. The Arab Spring, so popular uprising, met with violent repression by the authoritarian regimes. The failure of the international community and the human rights organization to intervene contributed to the perceptions that violence and extremism were the only effective means of resisting state brutality. This environment of collective grievance, coupled with perceived American betrayal of democratic aspirations, facilitated the rise of ISIS. The group can be seen as a revival of jihad Salafism. And through the doctrine of management of savagery, which became its strategic and behavioral framework, applied to both enemies and neutral parties in its war against authoritarian regimes. All these extremism actors exploited in the Palestinian cause, the handover of Iraq to Iran, and Western support of oppressive regimes, while also grounding their ideology in the fundamental texts and interpretations that legitimize violence, as discussed earlier. This constituted particularly savage phase in the evolution of Islamic extremism. The West appears not to have fully learned from these experiences. Its support for groups like Jabhat al-Nusra and its facilitation of their access to power in Syria indicate the potential onset of a new wave of violence, this time possibly between rights-seeking societies and extremism organizations. The absence of humanistic values in Arab education remains a central factor in the resistance of extremist movements. Equally, the lack of critical thinking, dialogue, and acceptance of opposing viewpoints, the ideological dehumanization of the other renders them unworthy of existence. Thus, radicalization acts to terror against them. Today, ongoing events in Gaza, Western support for extremism, factions in Syria backing the authoritative regime, and the unregulated nature of social media as a platform for extremism ideologies all contribute to the conditions ripe for the birth of a new cycle of extremism and violence. Thank you, and sorry to take your time.
Thank you very much. And so sorry, Morgan and Professor Machnikowski, that we had some 10 minutes beyond our schedule, behind our schedule. So Morgan, please, I will cut my my transition very quickly. And so we have just discussed about the Islamist and political Islamist terrorism and political Islam, and right now we will also talk about the homegrown extremism and terrorism, an element that is also important and dangerous with regard to the security of our societies. Please, Morgan, go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dennis. Thank you, dear colleagues. Fascinating to listen to. It's a pleasure to see you. Bonjour, marhaba. Unfortunately, I don't remember enough of my Arabic from university to be able to give my presentation in Arabic, so I'll give it in English. I apologize for that. Ana Asif. But I will talk about the Nordic Resistance Movement, which is the leading far-right terrorist group in Northern Europe, and the impacts of the American designation of this group as an SDGT, Specially Designated Global Terrorist Group, in the summer of 2024. And I'm sure I will struggle to keep time here, so I'll ask Dennis to let me know when there's 5 minutes left. Just interrupt me. I'll also ask you to say whether I will be successfully sharing my presentation, which I'll try to do now. Let's see. No, that's not it. Hang on a second. Let's see here. No, okay. I'm not sure Okay, but that's fine. I don't really need my slides are not that important. It's mostly bullet points, so I'll just get to it. So the Nordic resistance movement. In the interest of saving time here, I'll not go into a long explanation of who they are. I'll assume that you may have heard of it. If you haven't heard of it, it's enough to say that it's one of the most long-lived far-right violent groups in Northern Europe. It was founded in 1997. It has operated legally ever since then, even though it's an extremely violent group. It has been monitored continuously by the Swedish security services, but because Sweden has very, by Western standards, very permissive freedom of association, freedom of speech. This is a legally registered party, a legally registered association, even though they now have been designated a terrorist group by the United States. That really hasn't changed how Swedish authorities engage with it, which is something I'll return to. Let me just see if I can make one final attempt to share my presentation, because actually it would be useful. I'm not sure.
Otherwise, what we will do, you will send me your presentation and I will kindly forward it to all participants.
Okay, no, that's going to be too complicated. Okay, so I will be looking at my presentation, however. So what difference has this terrorist designation made? That's the question at issue in my organization, the Expo Foundation's recent report. It's an interesting case study because, of course, this is only the second ever white supremacist organization ever designated a terrorist group by the United States. It's also the first one, the only one in Western Europe. The only other one is the Russian Imperial Movement, which is a Russia-based group. So this is an interesting case study, and as I'm sure many of you already know, in many ways, every time the United States designates a terrorist group, it is in some sense a unique situation, because it's always about the particular context of what that group is, how they operate, where they operate, in trying to determine how they will be impacted. But as scholarship has shown, there is no real sort of standard metric for evaluating what impact a U.S. terror designation has. It's always very context dependent, and it rarely, the record shows that it rarely just completely kills a group or stops them in their tracks, but it does make life more difficult for them, and that has been the case for the Nordic resistance movement as well. So in our report, we find a number of circumstances that we've seen developing over the course of the past year. And it is impossible to isolate exactly which of these circumstances have been engendered directly by the US terror designation, but we can make an analysis of that. And so one thing we have seen is that it has caused economic harm. As you know, the SDGT designation is primarily meant to establish financial sanctions operated by OFAC at the US Treasury. And of course, Sweden is very much interconnected with the Western financial system, with the American financial system. So Swedish banks and Swedish financial institutions have completely debanked and sort of frozen out the Nordic resistance movements and its members from any use of their services. So this has made life difficult for them. As I will detail, they have managed to find some loopholes and have been able to evade the sanctions in some cases. But in many cases, they find it very hard to do any transactions, to manage or move or use money at all. The three particular leading individuals, also specifically designated as SDGTs, have been fired from their jobs and are finding it difficult to manage their own economy, or basically completely supported by the organization, and even that is difficult. There has been a strategic reorientation in how the NRM works. This was probably going to be the case anyway, even without the terrorist designation, but the designation has speeded up the NRM, moving from a situation where it was extremely hierarchical, extremely centralized, where the top leader basically acted as a dictator for the entire group, which of course has branches in multiple countries. It's based in Sweden, but it has branches in the neighboring countries. It was banned in Finland in 2020, but it still operates legally in the other Scandinavian countries. even before, a few months before the terrorist designation in February, they got a new top leader, and he implemented some changes in how the NRM operates. So now the regional managers, the sort of mid-level managers of the organization, now have much greater autonomy in deciding what type of activity to carry out. And this, of course, has been accelerated by the terrorist designation as a means of making the organization, as they see it, less vulnerable, so that the different regional branches of the group can still operate even if the leaders are constrained in various ways. I see that I'm going to have to be quite quick to manage the time here, so I'll move on very quickly. The NRM used to mock other right-wing extremist groups in Sweden and in the region for their use of masking, their activists when they went into the streets. They used to say, this makes them cowards, this means they're not serious about their activism, and so on. Well, now because of the terrorist designation, the NRM has also started masking its activists, making it more difficult for law enforcement and for researchers to identify them when they are out in the streets and so on. They have been able, despite this terrorist designation, they have been able to start recruiting younger and younger individuals. Now, I'm sure you all know that individuals involved in violent extremism all over the world are becoming younger and younger, both in radical religious terrorism and in far-right extremism, and the NRM Sweden is no exception, and younger individuals, very young teenage boys, are being recruited into these violent groups. And in some sense, it may be that the terrorist designation of the NRM has made the group even more attractive to this new generation of very young far-right activists who are obsessed with violence, obsessed with very sort of dark themes, transgressive themes, and to whom a terrorist label perhaps makes a group even more appealing to join. There's a lot to unpack there, but we don't have time to discuss that. One of the most important things, I think, for the overall theme of this panel in terms of challenges for EU countries is that the NRM has managed to, in spite of being under sanctions as an SDGT by the United States and the State Department and the Treasury Department, they are still able to use Meta's Facebook platform and Google's YouTube platform, respectively, in order to finance their activity and to spread their propaganda. So when it comes to Meta's Facebook, they have an external group, which does not call itself affiliated with the NRM, but which sells merchandise that is produced by the NRM and which explicitly says that the revenue from these sales will go to support the NRM. And the description, this is a closed group, but it is searchable. And in the description of this Facebook group, they even say, in order to fool Facebook's algorithms, we have to open up we have to keep this group open for your comments. But the reality is just, it's a shop for far-right merchandise. And this goes on openly. Even today, it's very strange that Meta is not being touched by the OFAC sanctions enforcement in this regard. When it comes to YouTube, the NRM maintains a channel that is their own branded propaganda channel for their one of their podcasts. What they do there is that they have a channel where they live stream their podcast content, which is, again, is violent, neo-Nazi, anti-Semitic, anti-democratic propaganda. And then that content is cleared away right after the transmission is through. So they don't store any content there, they just stream it. And this just goes on.
Morgan, just to let you know that you have 5 to 6 minutes left.
Yep, I'll speed it up. I find that that was one of the most interesting findings of our report. They have a diminished mobilization capacity, and I'll just save time by saying that we have a method of measuring how much capacity they have to mobilize people in the physical world that we've measured from year to year, and we can see that ever since the terrorist designation one year ago, they're operating at a much lower level of mobilization than they have in the past several years, even after they started sort of declining gradually in 2018. One of our findings is that the attention from Swedish agencies, from Swedish law enforcement, and from Swedish media did not spike or increase notably after the US designated as a terror group. Sweden has more or less sort of shrugged its shoulders at the fact that we now have a neo-Nazi terror group operating in our country, which I find remarkable, and which I believe is one reason that the impact has not been more significant of the terrorist designation, because as we know, a U.S. terrorist designation is also in some sense a way of naming and shaming and sort of prompting the host country of the group to act against them, and we haven't really seen any difference in this regard. And finally, also again, very importantly, so I'll end on this point, and very relevantly for the topic at hand here in terms of challenges for EU countries, even though they are under sanctions, and even though anyone sort of collaborating with them or having any kind of economic transactions with them should also in theory be touched by the US sanctions, they have been able to continue communicating closely and interfacing with other European far-right groups, specifically Devenir Europeo, a neo-Nazi group in Spain, Der Dritte Weg, the Third Way, a German neo-Nazi group, that have been able to visit the NRM for conferences in Sweden. And this is also a remarkable circumstance that they can continue to have close dialogue, cooperation with other European far-right groups in spite of the sanctions. And I'll basically wrap it up there, and I'll say that I wasn't able to show you the fancy slides and the cover of our nice report that we just put out. It is in Swedish, but we will be publishing an English language summary sometime in the week ahead. So keep an eye out on our LinkedIn or our channels. And please don't hesitate to contact me or my colleagues at the Expo Foundation here in Stockholm if you have any questions about the NRM, any questions about our research into white supremacy in Sweden or the region, in security terms or political terms or what have you. So thank you so much for your time and attention.
Thank you very much, Morgan, and for your very extensive but also brief presentation to respect our timeline. And I will tell you that we will definitely promote your report when it will be published, and we will help you as well to promote it, because it is also a part of, let's say, a threat that exists in this world. So the next panel is actually about the Russian state terrorism or state-sponsored terrorism, and I invite our speaker from Poland, who is Professor Ryszard Machnikowski, to talk about it. And we know that Poland has a lot of, let's say, Russia-related threats. So please, Ryszard, the floor is yours.
Sorry, I had some problems with mic, but I hope you hear me. Hello to everyone. It's great to be here. Thank you for your invitation to attend this important event. Well, of course, I would like to focus attention on this subject of Russian influence and Russian operations in Europe, because they are numerous and quite diverse, to put it in this way. And the question, I would like to skip the subject of whether Russia is a state sponsor or state terrorist state, because, well, this is a purely academic discussions. We have thousands of definitions of terrorism, sponsorship, and so on, so on. So I don't want to be involved in this kind of academic talk, but talk about some kind from the practical point of view, how it works in Europe. And also in Poland, because we do not have much problem with political Islam in this part of Europe, in central and eastern part. But definitely we do have problem with Russia as a kind of a state, kind of a regional power with nuclear capabilities. So it is more tricky to deal with. And of course, we can observe many examples of Russian interference and influence and actions in Europe, in many parts of Europe, not only in Central and Eastern Europe, but also in the West. And I would like also to refer to some sources, and I would like to recommend highly, because I have sent it to Dennis, he's going to send it to all participants, a very useful report, unfortunately not written by me, but he's my kind of my student once, Kacper Rękawek. Morgan actually knows him perfectly well, because he's also a participant of a very interesting project which is entitled Russia and the Far Right: Insights from 10 European Countries. And Morgan wrote a case study of Sweden. It was edited by Kacper Rękawek, Thomas Rennert, and Barbara Molas from ICCT in The Hague, in the Netherlands. But we also have a very interesting report made by Kacper, which is entitled Russian State Terrorism and State Sponsorship of Terrorism. So I would like to stress that this is also a very important source of my ponderings and comments. Yeah, but basically, we should remember that in November 2023, European Parliament declared Russia a state sponsor of terrorism. Of course, it was a kind of a declaration. It was not bred in some kind of huge consequences, but still we have some kind of a symbolic way of admitting that Russia is doing well in the sphere of terrorism. And it is definitely at least a sponsor of terrorism, if not is a sponsor terrorist state itself. What kind of acts of political violence can be delivered by Russia in Europe? Well, first of all, we have what is conventionally in military terms called sabotage. And what examples of sabotage we can enumerate? Well, this is, for example, the attempts of derailments and derailments, attacks on railway systems of many countries. It happened in Poland, it happened in Czech Republic, it happened in Slovakia, it happened in Germany. There are some suspicions that maybe even in France, but we are not sure. But definitely this is a kind of a classical sabotage when somebody wants to derail a train to cause some problems. The second important problem is the attempt of sending parcel bombs via planes. And I would like to remind you of an event which actually happened in Lithuania on November 25th of 2024, when DHL plane actually crashed into the land while landing in the Vilnius airport, and it was completely destroyed. That event led to the huge kind of investigation, which led to the conclusion that the Russian secret services were standing behind it. They were attempting to send bomb parcels, and they caused actually some harm in Birmingham and in Leipzig in some depots. And even in Poland, we have people who were arrested and who were involved in this plot. They were actually inspired by the Russian military service, GRU or GU as it is currently called. The other example of hybrid warfare is GPS signal interference, and actually in Lithuania, in Poland, and in many parts of Baltic states, also in Sweden and in Finland, it is actually carried out on the daily basis. Since the beginning of the year, we had 86 confirmed cases of signal interference, GPS signal interference. So far, it hasn't done much harm, but who knows what is going to happen next. Another kind of sabotage is the destruction of underwater cables and pipelines, and it is also, we have Sweden, Finland, Denmark, and Poland involved, because, and of course, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia as well, and it was definitely not done by some kind of a mistake or some kind of circumstances which are not having some deeper connections to the Russian intelligence. Another actions, assassinations and attempts of assassinations in Europe, even in Germany, but also in the United Kingdom and in many countries of the European continent. We have political murders at home in Russia. Political opponents, dissidents are killed by so-called unknown perpetrators, even if they are later arrested. There is, of course, no kind of connection to the government, but definitely this kind of connections should be. Another example, espionage. We have dozens of cases of espionage and espionage attempts in Poland only since last 2 years. We arrested 35 people in charge of espionage. They were, what is quite curious, mostly they are Ukrainians. Some of them are Belarusians, only one Russian, a couple of Poles, but most of them are Ukrainians. They are remotely, to put it in this way, recruited by the way of social networks, and then they are just giving tasks in this remote way. They were attempted to do some sabotage and espionage as well. Another important thing which is worth to stress is hijacking. Hijacking of planes. I would like to remind you of the case of Roman Protasevich, who is a Belarusian dissident, and maybe you know, maybe you don't, but the plane who was carrying Roman Protasevich from Greece, as far as I remember, to Poland was hijacked by Belarusian government, and it was forced to land in Minsk, and this dissident was arrested and then put to jail. So this is this interesting case. The investigation is also carried out by Polish authorities. I'm not a specialist in cyber attacks. I'm certain that many people are more skilled in this area, but it's of course not possible not to mention this kind of cyber attacks. I have a friend who is quite high in some authorities which are fighting cyber terrorism and cyber crimes, and he's actually telling me that every day we have 300 attacks on Polish critical infrastructure places daily, and sometimes when there is a climax of these attacks, it reaches 3,000 cases a day. So it is really a huge problem. Of course, we have to mention about the very interesting thing. Not many people could actually hear about it, but it is also where Kacper Rękawek is skilled in. This is the procedure of doxing. I don't know whether you are familiar with this, but doxing is a case when somebody, mostly who is considered to be an enemy of the Russian state, mostly fighters who are coming to Ukraine, but not only, they are labeled in many social networks using mainly Telegram. And by the way of doxing, there are some kind of claims that some criminal elements in the countries, when they are, for example, living or hiding, they are going to kill them. So this is a very dangerous case of using social networks to actually label and libel people, and then make problem to their lives when they are coming back home from Ukraine or from other places. I'm sure that France is especially badly experienced with Wagner Group in Africa, but of course Wagner Group in Africa did many harm to French influence in MENA region, but also they are active in our region, and of course Ukraine was a place when they were actively taking part in a just conventional war. So just to conclude, because I see that the time is going quickly, Russia is having many ways and many means of attacking us, and I think that I can openly say that we are actually at the state of hybrid war with Russia. By we, I mean Swedes, Finns, Latvians, Estonians, Lithuanians, Polish people, even Czechs, because there was an act of sabotage in Czech and in Slovakia. This is, of course, short of conventional war. And the main question is how long this state of events is going to happen. Because, as you know, Russia, for example, is building a huge military force in Laponia and close to the Finland border. And we expect that it might be also a kind of a provocation in this way. There might be a kind of a military provocation with the use of hybrid means in Latvia and Estonia, particularly in Narva region, where 95% of people are Russian, actually are Russians, and the same happens in Latvia, when, for example, 65% of the citizens of the capital of Latvia, Riga, are Russian-speaking. Of course, it does not mean that they are very happy to be invaded by Russia, because they are going to lose in this way European Union passports, which are allowing them to travel around the world without any problems. But still, there is a kind of a danger. So a lot of problems and a lot of things to think over, and a lot of attempts to counteract it. And fortunately, our counterintelligence services so far are capable enough to stop these provocations and these acts, but well, who knows, they need just one big score if they attempt and actually achieve success in some kind of a terrorist attack on some critical infrastructure in Central Europe, it might be a kind of a very destructive, not only for the reasons of physical damage, but also from propaganda. So I think that I will just stop here because I see that it is 4:15, and we need some kind of questions and answer session. So thank you very much for the invitation. This is a really vast subject, so it's impossible to cover in 15 minutes speech, but I would like to at least show you the most important questions concerning this problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. And actually the main idea of this webinar was to collect different experiences of threats from the Middle East, from the Western Europe, from the Nordic countries, and from the Central Eastern Europe, to somehow show that the threats are somehow, they are linked to one another. Sometimes they are completely different due to the historical, for example, or geographical or other particularities. And also we have here an old colleague of mine and a friend of mine who is James Green. And I also actually, by opening this Q&A session, I welcome him if he wants to ask questions. So he's also welcome. And then I give the floor to our associate expert, Harold Hyman, who will actually conclude, summarize what was said just recently during this webinar, and then who will moderate the Q&A session. And you're all welcome to ask questions, because I have one already.
All right, if people could raise their hand or put the little symbol, I'll know you want to ask a question. And, yes, okay, so Mohammed, you have a question, please, and then James.
It's okay, like we can give the mic to our friend James, to our guest here, because like he is Mr. James. Please go ahead.
By all means.
Thank you, Harold and Mohammed. I just have a really, first of all, I appreciate you all including me today, and Denise in particular, and a few other familiar faces there from previous discussions. What really struck me, and I am impressed by how you all have brought different aspects of terrorism radicalization together from different perspectives: the Russian, the Homegrown, and the Islamic. And just a few thoughts as going through the Homegrown. I was thinking, well, in their own countries, all of the movements that we look at international have a homegrown element. Even terrorism, Russian terrorism, going back into the 19th century, was a homegrown movement. And the idea that violent terrorism can achieve political ends in the modern time has strong roots in Russian political culture. And in their culture, it was a response to the failure of the system to react appropriately, to have other means. So there are a lot of themes that have come up, kind of linking these together, that are really interesting. And I'll play with in my own mind, and then maybe Deeth come back with a short piece if that works. My question, sort of the main question that popped up maybe for now, mainly for Morgan, but maybe for others. So Morgan, you mentioned how this terrorist designation is not having an impact that we wanted, and in other areas we're finding that current policies are not having the impacts that they were designed to or that were anticipated. And of course, bureaucracies have a hard time in adapting. They tend to be very conservative in what they apply. So if you were to model in your mind the issue of the Swedish group, is the issue, and more generally some of the far right movement's ability to use resources that in theory they shouldn't be able to use, is the problem just one of enforcement? Is it that if the Swedes would step up and actually get in line with the Americans, then everything would be okay? Or is the problem that the tool of the US terrorist designation no longer does what we thought it did, or what it might have done a decade ago? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean that's a great question. Thank you, and I won't take up tons of time answering it, which I certainly could try to do, because it's fascinating. There are several aspects. Look, I think that, you know, the scholarship that I've looked at says that basically, look, there is no clear metric or indicator for success or failure of a terrorist designation. I mean, obviously you would want the terrorist group to stop doing terror, stop existing, but that virtually never happens. But you do make life more difficult for them, and that has been achieved, you know, to some degree. And also from the American perspective, I suppose that, you know, their feeling could be that, you know, we haven't lost anything by doing this designation. You know, and it's probably gonna stick and stay there for a while, and it has made things more difficult for the NRM. Now, I'm sure that there was a hope and an expectation, perhaps, that it would maybe send a diplomatic and political signal to the Swedes that, look, you're not doing anything here. You fail to. There have been attempts at legislation of banning racist groups, which Sweden has an obligation to do under the UN Convention against racial discrimination and so on. We haven't implemented Article 4 of that convention. You're not doing anything really here. So here's a strong political signal. Maybe you can use that. That hasn't really happened. I mean, very, very briefly, there are different levels of reasons for that. They are cultural, they are constitutional, they are political, and to some extent, they're in terms of the toolkit that law enforcement has available to it. But we've argued, my organization, which is not primarily an organization that does advocacy or policy advice, we are investigative journalists, but we've had sort of perforce to start offering some policy recommendations because we so often are asked to analyze these phenomena. And one thing we've said is that, look, even without changing the law, even within this extremely permissive constitutional environment that the NRM operates in, there's still so many administrative measures that could be taken. Look, the tax agency, the police, the security services, you could be pushing and constricting this group a lot more instead of basically letting them operate as though they're any other group. And that, I think, requires a political signal from Swedish political leadership, you know, akin to what the Speaker of the German Parliament said a few years ago. You know, a man of the right, Schäuble, you know, as Speaker of the Parliament said, look, far-right extremism is unacceptable in Germany. It should be stamped out politically. Racism is not okay. Islamophobia is not okay. Now, did that solve all the problems in Germany of far-right extremism? Certainly not. But it was a political signal that told public servants, law enforcement, that, you know, go after these people. Do what can be done within the framework of the current laws. And there is no signal like that in Sweden, unfortunately.
Well, I think James wants to bounce back. Or you left your hand up.
I just left my hand up. Sorry.
Okay.
I'm a neophyte on this. No, I'm very interested in Morgan's answer. And,
okay, please finish, Morgan.
Yeah, no, I was basically, I mean, like I said, I could go on babbling about this forever, and I won't. But it is an interesting question, and I think much more could be done already. Part of the problem is political. Like I said, there has been across the past few decades, there have been 1 or 2 or 3 attempts to legislate against the type of organization that NRM is. And it usually runs into political divisions that the parties in parliament can't agree on legislation that they think, you know, is appropriate. There's also sort of competing interpretations of what the Constitution allows in terms of prescribing a group. But the situation is kind of bizarre because Sweden is effectively exporting violent extremism to our neighboring countries. So the NRM is based in Sweden, has its leadership here, most of its organizational resources here, and then they sort of go to Oslo, go to Copenhagen, go to our neighboring countries and do riots and violence. And, you know, I'm sort of often surprised that our neighboring countries don't, you know, sort of push Sweden to do more to prevent this group. I mean, ultimately, Finland decided to ban the Finnish branch of the group on its own. And, you know, from what I hear, that has been at least partly effective.
Next question, anyone? Because otherwise, yes, Mohammed, please.
Okay, thank you so much. My question could go to anyone, like maybe I'll ask Professor Machnikowski maybe to take this part. Do you believe that European Union's international measures and adopted policies are sufficient to combat terrorism? The first part, and the second part, do they conduct sufficient or due diligence before they are approving or licensing a civil society group or a research center or whatever? The cause behind my question, because there is a lot everywhere in Europe, a lot of either NGOs or civil society group or research center, or at the end, the background, it serves terrorism, serves the lobbies against the European Union itself. And okay, we all believe in democracy, but sometimes democracy, it's a weapon, it's a gun, it's something in our head.
Okay, thank you very much for this question. This is a tricky question, but I would like to be as brief as it is possible. My guess is that, well, this is my impression, and I think that I'm not entirely wrong in this impression, that fighting terrorism, combating terrorism and radicalization is basically the responsibility of the nation states. And of course, we have European Union, which is, for example, guiding, yes, providing some guidance, or establishing some kind of a forums for exchange of experiences, like RANs, for example, radicalization awareness networks, which are working quite well and gathering many experts. But I conducted a research in 4 countries, in Spain, France, Belgium, and Netherlands recently. I was in France many times. And my guess is that France is very, very jealous about the capabilities and about the means of combating terrorism. And it's not very much EU-oriented, to put it in this way very mildly. Because the services and police, French police, for example, considers themselves as one of the top-notch, the best of the best, who are actually tackling the problem of terrorism. So I had some impression that they simply do not think that they need such a forum to exchange experiences, because they can sell some experiences of France, yes, to give advice to other countries which are less skilled in fighting terrorism. So I do not think that the European Union, well, to put it in one word, no, it is not sufficient, but basically this is due to the fact that European Union is not primarily cannot be used as a kind of a forum for combating terrorism, because it is not the main problem from the point of view of European Union politicians. I guess this is my guess. Terrorism happens once a time, yes, and this is the problem of a country. If something happens in Belgium, this is the problem of Belgium, and European Union is suffering many other problems which are considered to be of more importance, I guess.
Question to Denis.
Yes, thank you. And actually, initially I had a question to Morgan, but somehow James has already asked it, like half of the question, it correlated with mine. So I'll ask our guest, Youssef Chiheb, and I will translate into French my question. So in France, we have, and it has already been pointed out in the first panel, that we have the rise of the political Islam, and that it is somehow a danger to our societies. So my question is, what kind of policies we could adopt or we could think of in order to offset those threats? Alors, la traduction, j'ai une question, comme quoi c'était évoqué pendant le premier panel, qui est l'islam politique, c'est une menace à notre société française. Et donc, je voudrais bien savoir quelle politique pourrait-on potentiellement adopter afin de diminuer cette menace. Peut-être si vous avez une réponse à cette question. Et je vais demander à Harold à traduire. So Harold, please translate the answer. We don't hear. You have to.
Voilà. Ça va, merci.
Moi, je pense que la réponse à la menace que l'islam politique n'est plus une question uniquement française, mais une question européenne, voire euro-méditerranéenne. Et que peut-être il y a quelques leviers juridiques. Je rappelle qu'entre parenthèses, sur les pays que j'ai cités, notamment la Jordanie et l'Algérie et le Maroc, ont interdit par leur parlement les partis dites frères musulmans. Donc on peut aussi s'en inspirer et interdire des mouvements de cette dangerosité. Deuxième question, il faut revoir de fond en comble l'espace Schengen. L'espace Schengen est une véritable erreur géopolitique qui a été commise par les Européens et qui est au contraire une formidable opportunité pour la circulation des idées de l'islam politique et du terrorisme. Et enfin, il faut penser que la Russie, comme l'a dit mon collègue de Pologne, la Russie utilisera un jour ou l'autre tous ces réseaux dormants, les réseaux dormants en Europe pour frapper l'Europe. Merci.
Right. So I took it down in French. So the response is no longer strictly French, nor even just European. It's Euro-Mediterranean. And Jordan, Algeria, and Morocco have used legal means to ban Ikhwan-related parties. And the other problem, the other thing that could be done, is to completely overhaul the Schengen concept, which is a formidable mistake, a European mistake, and it's a great opportunity for Islamist ideas and terrorism to move about. And finally, we must realize that Russia will someday or other use its sleeping network in Europe. There it is. I see Morgan has a question, and then I'll slip one in before the end.
Yes, thank you. I'll try to be very brief. I just wanted to address Mohammed's question and just provide a very limited, perhaps, but a sort of perspective on this from Sweden. I think that perhaps a sort of case study as well in some of the political difficulties around this, because in Sweden, I think the necessary and reasonable discussion about whether there is enough due diligence in, for example, public funding for civil society in terms of making sure that public funds are not going to anti-democratic or reactionary networks like the Muslim Brotherhood or so on. That has been entirely eclipsed, and sort of that discussion has been entirely warped by the domestic racist radical right in Sweden, which is strongly Islamophobic and sort of obscures the real issue by convoluting it into this nested discourse of scaremongering about, we need to cut off all funding for all civil society, and we have to stop all minority groups from getting money for their various community activities, and basically taking this problem and sort of turning it into an instrument for their own reactionary agenda, which is a lot more urgently politically threatening even than the Muslim Brotherhood. So this is just to offer some perspective on a situation where it's very difficult now to disentangle the real question of what groups in civil society should be receiving funding in a reasonable way from this larger radical right program of basically dismantling, sort of establishing an illiberal Hungary-style illiberal democracy in Sweden, which the radical right seeks to do by using means such as control of funding for civil society, which traditionally in Sweden has been very autonomous and very pluralistic and liberal and generously funded.
A question by Mohammed, please.
It's a kind of a comment. Thank you so much, Morgan. Thank you, Professor. One of the reasons of my question, especially like when I ask about the due diligence, so fast, like 20 seconds, just like back then 2017, I had a speech, like a discussion with one of the assistant of Federica Mogherini. I was shocked, surprised that there was a new research center to combat terrorism established by the EU. She was happy to tell me there is one Syrian guy is working with us. She mentioned the family name. I told her just to tell you this family, the whole family, they are Salafis. So
lack of identification, I guess one could say.
It was, I was shocked, then she was shocked. We exchanged like.
I'm going to slip in my question. Does anyone believe that Russian state hybrid warfare plus the Nordic resistance movement plus the jihadi forces can converge into an international of chaos? Bit of a rhetorical question, but
Yeah,
Ryszard or Morgan, whatever.
yeah, I'll take a very quick crack at it.
Youssef, pardon.
I will follow you. Yeah. So Morgan, go, and then I will follow you.
Yeah.
Oui, attendez, je traduis pour Youssef. Est-ce que comment dirais-je, la guerre hybride menée par l'État russe peut converger avec la nouvelle résistance nordique et avec le djihadisme pour former une internationale du chaos?
I think that what we have seen and been able to document is definitely a convergence between Russian state interests and the strategic interests and operation of the extreme right in the West. And this has been amply documented. I wrote about it in this report that was mentioned earlier. And in fact, there was a close alliance between the Nordic resistance movement and the regime-connected Russian imperial movement a few years ago, which I'm sure was a contributing factor to the US eventually designating both of these groups as terrorist organizations. However, these alliances, strategic as they may be, have also proven in the past to be unstable, tenuous, often incompetently handled. Certainly, the convergence of Russian interests and far-right interests present a current hybrid threat to European countries as we speak. I don't know whether it's possible for jihadism to converge into that, or to what degree. But yeah, I think we should be open to seeing these overlaps and where they converge, if only through common interests rather than perhaps actual organizational or financial ties, even though we also see those sometimes.
Okay.
Ryszard, yes.
If I may address this question, because this is a very interesting question. Basically, they had already made a chaotic and environment in Europe and created havoc. And I will just give you a kind of an example. This is, of course, not a hybrid war, but conventional warfare. When they attacked Ukraine, they forced emigration from Ukraine, and I'm sure that you are familiar that in the first 2 months of war, we had 2 million Ukrainians in Poland. And it was February and March, which is winter usually in Poland. And definitely it was designed to create some kind of chaos in Poland. By the grace of God, we just managed to operate very quickly, and we didn't have any kind of humanitarian problems within these winter months. But it was, of course, tested before by this way of immigration from Belarus, which actually preceded the invasion in Ukraine. They also wanted to open the free pass to Germany, because these immigrants who are going from Belarus, they don't want to stay in Poland because it is not social, from the point of view of social services, attractive. They wanted to go to Germany. And imagine this kind of walk away from the Polish eastern border to Berlin, flooded by tens of thousands of people just walking through motorways to Berlin, like we could see, for example, in 2015. We are in chaos, actually. So just to put it in this way. Thank you.
Denis, you tell us when we have to.
Yes. Maybe Youssef wanted to add something, I'm not sure. And then we have, I guess we'll take the last question from James, and then we will wrap up, and we will have, and I will ask our Managing Director, Mohammed Kudmani, to summarize this discussion and to make the closing remarks. Thank you very much.
James.
I thought Youssef had a question ahead of me in the queue, but is that right?
Youssef, vous n'avez pas de questions en attente.
Moi, je voulais juste dire une dernière chose, rapidement, c'est que la future menace terroriste qui plane sur l'Europe ou sur l'Amérique, le profil des terroristes ne sera plus un profil classique, c'est-à-dire de confession musulmane, de couleur basanée, en provenance du Moyen-Orient, d'Afrique. La Russie est en train de former, avec les Iraniens, des mercenaires de terrorisme à la solde et qui travaillent pour le plus offrant. Et sont en train de s'entraîner en Afrique et au Sahel pour opérer à l'intérieur du sol européen, et qui sont des Européens faciles, très dissimulés, très formés pour réaliser des opérations comme des mercenaires, comme Wagner. Je pense que le concept Wagner va être transposé sur les futures stratégies terroristes en Europe et aux États-Unis, malheureusement.
Bon, je traduis votre prévision terrifiante. Yes, so the future menace for America and Europe will be a new profile of terrorists who will not be Muslim and brown-skinned, and will be formed by Russian and Iranian agents to become mercenaries of terror. These will be people from Europe, and they will be trained in the Sahel, and they will be used in Wagner-type operations. And the Wagner model is now being transposed to this new theater. James.
Yeah, thank you, Harold. That's actually a perfect kind of a segue, because and Youssef and I didn't coordinate this ahead of time. I think one of the things we need to look at is the transformation of radical movements and how those radical movements come from the societies or terrorist movements, the societies that generate them. So earlier on, there was a comment, very correct, that the EU looks at this as a nation state issue, and it really is an EU or even a broader, greater Mediterranean issue. And that's correct. At the same time, we need to go back down the chain and say it's really a societal issue. It's the movements in Russia, like Wagner or the earlier terrorist groups that are exported. It's the hybrid warfare we're seeing today are developments that Putin used within his own country to establish control. And so we're seeing the export of these internally developed mechanisms, sometimes intentionally, like in the case of Putin, sometimes not so intentional because of stresses within the system. We see this in America, where the political movement has created large social gaps in who believes they are represented by modern liberal democracy. And in fact, that maybe certain groups have defined modern liberal democracy in a way which excluded many others. And that has created reactions within our own systems that have been unhelpful. So I think one of the things that kind of the biggest point that I'm taking out of this is the need to sort of follow the strings back into society and understand what's driving the radicalization at a social level, and then what kinds of social responses can work. And I think some of the ones that have been done before, in the US, for example, there's a famous organization, the Southern Poverty Law Center, which has become a gold standard, so to speak, and I use that in air quotes, for identifying radical groups. And it basically says anyone who doesn't agree with their version of what a free society is a radical group. That has not been helpful, or the way that has evolved has not been helpful in allowing for stresses within the American system, allowing for people to be brought in. So I use that's just a small microcosm, but I think that social question, and if we look at that at a governmental kind of perspective, or even maybe an NGO perspective, there are cases in Britain where nonprofits have been created to address this in ways that the UK government couldn't, when there were issues of the alienation of Muslim communities from the establishment. There are cases in the Netherlands, for example. They have a very comprehensive method of looking at national security assessments across government and across society. So these are things we might want to think about, even as we're looking at being able to deal at a larger scale in terms of responses, how to get that granular and integrate the societal aspects of it that will really make the difference in over the long term. Thank you all. It's been very interesting. I would add here, sorry, one more thing. Ryszard, a perfect example of I'm sure supported by government action, but the main thing that prevented the Russian plan from February and March of flooding Poland with Ukrainians and overwhelming your country was the Polish people themselves and their amazing hospitality and response. It was that bottom-up effort that made the difference. Without that, the government response would not have been successful.
Denis, it's conclusion time, I guess.
Yes, and I'd like to thank you all, and then also give the floor to Mohammed, who will say his closing remarks to this event. And from my part, I thank you all for your time and patience with us, because we were not really, we didn't keep up with the time properly, but still, thank you very much all. And Mohammed, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you so much, Denise. Very shortly commenting before the closing remarks. I think towards everything said, what we are expecting, we are going, I think there's a huge task, or a huge mission to the whole, await the whole European governments. It's to enhance, to support, to generate, call it whatever you want, the civic citizenship feelings and responsibilities between the non-European and the European, who they feel non-European, and all of them. To be honest, personally, I always say civic citizenship is the silent loyalty upon which a nation is built. Extremism is a loud betrayal that destroys the foundations of the nation. So, gentlemen, colleagues, experts, and friends, as we conclude today's important session, allow me, on behalf of the entire MENA Research Center team, to express my sincere gratitude to each of our distinguished speakers. Your insights today have not only deepened our understanding of the evolving terrorist threats, but also reminded us of the complexity and urgency of the work ahead. From the ideological roots of violent and non-violent extremism, to the troubling resurgence of homegrown radical movements, and the challenges posed by state-sponsored tactics, today's discussions were rich, timely, and essential. Since our founding in 2019, MENA Research Center has remained committed to confronting radical ideologies and with knowledge, dialogue, and the power of enlightened thinking. We have long championed the values of the Enlightenment, the social contract, and the need to empower women and protect childhood, because we believe that building resilient societies requires more than just analyzing threats. It requires investing in human dignity, education, and freedom. Today's event is a part of the broader mission to connect researchers, share knowledge, and foster cooperation between regions institutions that fact common threats and share common values. To our speaker, thank you for your dedication, clarity, and courage. To our partners and audience, we look forward to future collaboration, deeper dialogue, and shared action. Let us continue working together across borders and disciplines toward more secure, enlightened, and humane world. Thank you so much, and until next time.
Thank
Thanks.
you very much. A pleasure meeting you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you. It was a real pleasure, everyone.
Yes.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks, Dean.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Au revoir, Denise.